Good evening, afternoon, APUSH students. Whether you're coming from B block or C block or G block or Mr. Chamberlain's E block, welcome, welcome. I am now on to period 3, as the College Board calls it, which is basically the revolutionary period. So I'm dividing this into 3 parts. First part's going to be about the pre-war protest issues. Second part will lead us from the Declaration of Independence to the Constitution. Part 3 will be the first few years, the early republic under the new Constitution. So, this is the first one of those. What's in this review? Some context of what's going on before the crisis, the crisis itself, the imperial crisis or constitutional crisis, a theme of resistance to rebellion, and some overall themes which will show that number 3, resistance to rebellion, is not necessarily a linear, simple thing. So, got my Gibson hat today for Gibson guitars. So, shout out to Gibson guitars. And let's go! Alright, so what is going on that brings on a crisis in the 1760s? Well, this classic map here explains to us there had been a war from 54 to 63, known as the French Indian War, also called the Great War for Empire. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. There have been a lot of wars during the colonial time. We don't look at them in general. We look at this one because it was the longest and had the biggest impact. It basically boots the French pretty much out of North America, except for some fishing rights you see and some islands. And it just changes the landscape of the colonial world. And for our immediate attention, it creates a massive war debt for the British, who have to send over a lot of troops to protect their colonies and are interested in recouping that debt, of course. And one immediate result is this line drawn, the red one there, you see, the Proclamation of 1763, which forbids settlement beyond that line. So that there are some things in here that can create some tensions, and that they will indeed do. So, what I'm calling the constitutional crisis, I've called it the imperial crisis. Well, what do we mean by that anyway? Well, first of all, we need to understand that the word constitution at this time does not mean what we call it is. We think of the Constitution, capital C, as this written thing, Article 1, Article 2, etc. Literally what it meant in this time was how a government is constituted. So there was something talk of what was called the British Constitution, but it wasn't one document, it was a bunch of documents, and the idea is collectively these all made what constituted the British government. So when we say there's a constitutional crisis, they're not arguing about one specific document, they're arguing about how government is constituted. So another big context here is an ideology from the 18th century, influenced by the Enlightenment, and comes over during the 18th century with all the trade going on in the Atlantic economy as colonists become more literate and read things coming in from England. It's called republicanism, and there's a lot to republicanism, but for what we need right now is, as an ideology, it emphasizes what is called virtue, that people need to be virtuous and serve their country, serve their republic. You devote your talents to it. That's the ideal. I think we still see that around today. We like to say we are virtuous people when we go serve the public. But the other end of that, so there's a duality there, is corruption, this fear that once people get into power, they will become corrupt and they will forget to serve the public and instead go after their own selfish needs and not respect the rights of the people. So it's both a call to act a certain way and has a built-in fear, not quite paranoid, but a Republican, small r, one who believes in Republican, would always be on the lookout for corruption. Like, is their government doing something that looks corrupt? And it's what's worth noting here is, another thing is, there are conflicting theories of representation at this time. The British government sees representation as a virtual thing. That doesn't matter how many seats there are in Parliament, everyone is virtually represented. They don't have districts and numbers. It is, when Parliament meets, it represents everyone. The colonists, by this point, their local governments have gone to what's called actual representation. So towns will send a representative to the colonial legislature, so they actually represent that town. And these two things, views of constitutions, republicanism, and representation, they've been there. It's the aftermath of the war that's going to activate them. So the long-term causes are in place. The short-term cause will be the end of this war and the crisis it brings on that will help create what we call the imperial crisis, lead to the American Revolution, that kind of stuff. So to get from resistance to rebellion, I've got here a protest against the Stamp Act, and of course the famous Boston Massacre engraving by Paul Revere. So here we go. If you want a short version, remember everything. My sugar stamp declares your Townsend Massacre tea intolerable. That's the order of all the sort of laws and incidents that went from protest to ultimately what will lead up to war. Now, you do not need to know these all. The AP test is not going to ask you all to list them or anything like that. So I'd say get to know one pretty well and know some themes. So the themes are representation in a lot of these is the issue rather than actual money. Like the Stamp Act is not a really heavy tax. The Townsend Acts are not heavy taxes. It's about people are protesting the issue that they're not represented in making them. So for example here, the Tea Party actually happens after the price of tea is lowered. So people are not complaining about high taxes. They're just complaining that taxes are made without their consultation. So that's a key thought to keep in mind. And the other is, by the end of this period, the intolerable acts are like 74. The Stamp Act is 65. So the purchase of the Stamp Act, people are saying, oh, we might be enslaved and the British are going to take our rights. And you could say, well, it's only a penny tax. But by the intolerable acts, Britain starts to do the things that colonial leaders had thought they were going to do all along. So closing the port of Boston, changing the way people are tried. These are the sorts of things, taking away rights that they feared was going to happen. You could argue that the colonists brought them on themselves with their protests, but eventually you get to the point where the very thing you had feared happens. And I just offer, was that a self-fulfilling prophecy? So the two themes here we want to look as we think about this resistance to rebellion, and they are contrary themes, because as good AP students, we want to be able to keep in mind contradictory thoughts can exist in a culture, and not everyone thinks the same thing, and there's a diversity of thought about everything. So on the one hand, the protest to things like the Stamp Act and the Townsend Act can be pretty aggressive. You go to a stamp collector's house, you force them out. It wasn't violence necessarily, but you might hang someone in effigy. The governor's house in Massachusetts gets burned down. The Townsend Acts are very aggressive boycotts. People are coerced into following them. The Boston Massacre, of course, actually turns violent. The Tea Party is destruction of property. So there can be some real aggressive things going on during this period. However, at the same time, there are people who want to avoid conflict, like the Stamp Act Congress. About 9 colonies got together to protest the Stamp Act. They issued this document, and it's fairly mild. It opens actually with things like, we are loyal subjects, we love being part of the empire. It's very polite language. So you've got that contrasted with waking up the stamp collector in the middle of the night and forcing him to leave town. So both these things are going on. And then even, after Lexington conquered, the summer of 75, the Olive Branch petition happens, where the Congress sends this petition to the king asking, can we still avoid a larger war? So they're both happening, and that's what you got to understand. It isn't just a linear thing where things get ramped up gradually. There's dips and people thinking different thoughts at different times. So the other theme, which we're going to see more in the next episode, if you want to call it that, is what one historian, Bernard Balin, called the contagion of liberty. The idea that you start protesting constitutional issues about representation, which is fairly esoteric, maybe not important to a lot of people, but it surfaces other issues and other people to the surface. So, for instance, there are groups formed called Daughters of Liberty, where women get involved in colonial protests. They help out with the boycotts. They spin clothes, so you won't buy British clothes. You remember the song we did in class? Young ladies in town. So that activates an idea like women are participating politically. And what does that mean? Is a woman allowed to participate politically? And if so, does that mean they have a political voice? Should they have a political voice? Slavery starts to surface as an issue. I mean, it's always been there, of course. But if you're going to start using words like the British are taking away our rights and people have rights, you activate the idea of, well, who are those rights for? Thomas Jefferson even uses language like the Towns and Acts are a plan by the British to enslave us. So you start using that word in a bad way. So you're bringing issues to the surface that Balin called it contagion, because this idea of liberty spreads around. All right, and that is the end of part 1 here. I'm going to shoot this up onto Google Classroom. Going to make part 2 in just a little bit. And tomorrow I will have part 3 and some short answers, or hopefully an update about the AP exam, and we'll see what goes on there. Have a great day and hope you're inside and staying safe and all that good stuff. Ta-ta!